see you.
The PBS series Making Black America showcases the vast social networks and organizations created by and for Black people. In the 4-part series, famed documentarian Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. sits down with noted scholars, cultural leaders, and old friends to explore what it means to be a Black American.
Are there still things that you can only say to another Black person that you would never dream of saying to one of your white colleagues?
Absolutely, yes.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned for a recent panel discussion about the film that was recorded live in front of a virtual audience. Our panel included the film's director, Stacy Holman, University of Texas professor Dr. Ashley Farmer, and senior pastor of the historic Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston, Texas, Pastor Dr. D.Z. Cofield. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. Houston Public Media recently partnered with Texas PBS to conduct a virtual event that featured a 30-minute screener of a 4-part series entitled Making Black America Through the Grapevine, hosted by acclaimed Harvard scholar and documentarian Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Throughout our history in the United States, Black people have fought mightily against slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and racial discrimination, striving incessantly for genuine equality. As noble and as heroic as this chapter in our history has been, that's only part of the story.
Black America has never been...
The film chronicles the vast social networks and organizations created by and for Black people, from the establishment of the Prince Hall Masons in 1775 through the formation of all Black towns and business districts, historically Black colleges and universities, destinations for leisure, and the social media phenomenon of Black Twitter. Now, at this virtual event facilitated by yours truly, over 100 digital audience members tuned in and watched a 30-minute teaser of the film. After the screener was shown, I was joined by 3 panelists: Stacy Holman, the producer and director of Making Black America; Dr. Ashley Farmer, a renowned historian who's featured in the film and professor at the University of Texas at Austin; and Pastor Dr. D.Z. Cofield, a KTSU radio host and senior pastor of the historic Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. We've captured that panel discussion on tape, and you'll also hear quick clips and referenced snippets from the series. I see you, as we begin our panel discussion on the PBS series Making Black America.
First, let's get everyone's thoughts and ideas on this virtual event as it relates to Black joy. What is Black joy? How would you personally describe or define what Black joy means to you? Stacy Holman, the producer and director of this incredible project. What say you, Stacy? What does Black joy mean to you?
Thank you, Eddie. I would define Black joy.
Yes.
This summer, I was in LA hanging with some friends for 50th birthday. And one of those people that was my line sister. So Black joy was seeing my college friends, went to Dillard University, seeing my line sister, seeing other family from Dillard, and just being in each other's presence, just celebrating, 50 years, celebrating life, celebrating each other, celebrating our friendship. So that is Black joy to me and for me.
And you mentioned line sister. What sorority?
I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated.
Excellent. We'll get more into that and the reasoning behind the Greek letter sororities and fraternities later in the show. But thank you for that nugget. Let's see, Dr. Farmer, what do you think? What in your mind is the definition of Black joy?
Oh, it's such a complicated question, but I think that it's the small and big moments where Black people for a moment forget about all of the oppression, all of the gaze on us, and simply just be. So sometimes it's like a girl skipping down the street or being on her bicycle, forgetting for a second of all the dangers that constantly surround us. Sometimes it's get-togethers in the kitchen, right? Sometimes it's events like homecoming. I went to HBCU, I went to Spelman College, and I think about what a space that is when we all gather and remember our days of being close together and studying and living Black life, not always under the gaze of oppression. So I think we should think about it as kind of those everyday little moments that we eke out, but also that collective coming together to celebrate each other and our lives.
I love that. I love that. Pastor Cofield, you can wrap up that question and share your thoughts. What does Black joy mean to you?
Yeah, so Eddie, thank you for having me on as part of this panel. I think for me, the celebrating of who I am and who others are who are like me without being judged by others. Just the space of being who I am instead of being tagged with what I am. And there are really important spaces that I think are important to us, whether there are our fraternity, sorority, or fraternal organizations, or the church. But we experience it even in business settings like the barbershop or the beauty shop, right? Where we can just celebrate who we are. After code switching all week long, we can just come and just give each other the nod, and we made it another week, and we can do our thing. And for me, that's Black joy, just celebrating the essence of who we are as a people without having to justify anything, without having to squash any part of us or our being. We can just be who we are. And that's, I think, the beauty of Black joy.
I love that. And that's why I wanted to start off our questioning with that understanding of the importance of highlighting joy, right? We always talk about struggle, but let's focus on joy, right? And here you have a project, an amazing film that honors the celebration of being Black in America in a time where many of us were discriminated against. We were held down by hidden, unspoken shades of racism at work, at restaurants, at grocery stores, at the local bank. White supremacy surrounding us at its peak, but Black folk took it amongst themselves to organize, to vote, to support one another, to help finance one another, to encourage one another, to inspire one another. And it was the actions of Blackness, the sounds of Blackness, the perseverance of Blackness that really kept us alive. And we survived, right? That brings me to my next question. And Stacey, I really would like to circle back to you before we get into the discussion of racial integration. This is such a powerful project. How long did it take for this journey of film to be assembled? I mean, I think you mentioned to me offline at one point that it was a journey, right, to put this project together. But, how long did it take for this project to see the light of day?
Well, this project actually started in 2020, and we all know where we were in 2020. We were in a pandemic. So just, that alone, just a lot of stuff took a lot longer. And Ashley can even tell you that because we were filming people remotely. So from 2020 into really this year, when we finally finished, all the coloring and all the mixing. So it was definitely a good year and a half, almost close to 2 years to really getting this film. And also just the subject matter itself. I mean, there's no guidebook to making Black America. There's not one single book to kind of just say, well, from 1775, the Prince Hall Masons to, present day Black Twitter, that doesn't exist. So just research alone, that was a huge integral part of really developing this story and taking the time that we did to make it.
I can imagine. And Dr. Farmer, as a historian, you had to have been on cloud nine, right? To hear about this series and to, be even more thrilled to be one of the featured voices in Making Black America, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, tell us more about your involvement with the film. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, anytime one of these films that Henry Louis Gates makes comes about, you're always really excited because what these films offer an opportunity for people to do is get the kind of history that we often at this point only teach in classroom settings. Sometimes college students don't even take this kind of stuff. And you get, a really great solid history from, the start of the nation through present day. So I'm a historian of the Black Power movement, and it is a space where people found Black joy, Black political resistance, right? Beauty in themselves, yes. Beauty in other people. And also when particularly Black women came into their own, kind of combining this understanding of Black power and what we would now term Black feminism. So a lot of what I talk about is how Black people navigated this political moment of Black power and empowerment, how diverse and interesting the movement was, not just, Black is beautiful, not just the Black Panther Party, but really a broad swath of people trying to think about how Black people navigate this world. And then in particular, how Black women made it their own, both in terms of the aesthetic that they had, but also in terms of making sure their priorities, their political priorities, were part of the movement as well.
Yeah. Pastor Cofield, we cannot have a conversation about the celebration of Black America, honoring our Black pioneers without recognizing the significance of how religion and spirituality have played a key role defining who we are as Black Americans and where we've come from and from whence our faith, our health, our inspiration comes from.
Folks are still going to church, going to mosque. Folks are still organizing. Folks are still partying together. We're resilient folk. We're resilient folk. Even in our darkest hour, there are these eruptions of joy.
Dr. Cofield, if you will, as you were watching this 30-minute snippet of Making Black America, what were some of the more compelling, the more riveting aspects to you? What part or parts of the screener did you find particularly interesting?
So I think overall, the fact that while we have come a long ways, in many instances, we haven't come that far. And we're still facing many of the challenges that our foreparents faced, just in a different form. So it's almost as if Jim Crow is dead, but James Crow II is alive and well. And so how do we now strategize how to combat the social evils that are still upon us? When I heard the statement, the high cost of integration.
Yes.
So I'm writing an op-ed article, and I know it's going to be controversial, but one of the tenets of it is the idea of the blessing of a segregated Sunday. You often hear people talk about Sunday morning being the most segregated hour in our country. And I say bravo to that. And I say bravo to that because we have a different agenda in the gospel that we preach in the Black church than the gospel that is preached in the white church. We're not even preaching in many instances the same Bible. And so for the church that is historically Black, we preach a gospel of freedom and deliverance and joy, where we see our white counterparts preaching oppression and submission, and in many instances, just omitting passages of scripture that speak to my value and my self-worth as being created in the image of God. In Houston, we had an interesting dilemma that is still in existence today out of this high cost of integration, because there was an act called the Singleton Ratio Plan. The Houston Independent School District has worked harder to avoid the spirit and the law of Brown versus the Board of Education than it has to implement it. And that's to this day right now. And a court ruled after two girls filed lawsuits in the late 1960s, that is, to implement Brown versus the Board of Education, that the school district needed to make hay slowly. How do you make hay slowly? I don't know. But, here we are 60 years later, and we're still facing the same problem. And they did everything they could to get around it. And I think integration in many ways has hurt our community, has hurt the fabric of our community. I was not privileged to go to an HBCU, not because I didn't want to, but my father, who was born in Lincoln, Alabama, and picked cotton, When I told him I wanted to go to HBCU, he said, why? And I said, I want the Black experience. And he said, you're going to be a nigga all your life. He said, man, white folk are going to let you know that. He said, I want you to go up to this school and learn what these white folk have to teach you. And so I went to a PWI. I followed my father's leadership and guidance, but that never seared my consciousness because he was a writer, he was a reader. And so I was educated at his foot in many of these issues, which is why I have such a passion for my community and really enjoy today. So that for me really stood out. That's so much of our culture that we're trying to reclaim, we've given up in an attempt to integrate, which became more assimilation. And I think we're fighting now to reclaim some of that history and vibrancy in our community.
Coming up, more of our panel discussion as we continue a conversation about a new PBS series hosted by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. entitled Making Black America Through the Grapevine. We'll go deeper and explore racial integration within the Black community. How did integration impact the state of our Black institutions following the Civil Rights Movement? And a big question that I've always grappled with: what is it that makes Black Americans so resilient in a country that still, to this very day, doesn't fully embrace them? I'm Eddie Robinson. I See You returns with another provocative segment right after this. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to a recent virtual panel discussion that was recorded live in partnership with Texas PBS and Houston Public Media. Our panelists included Stacey Holman, the producer and director of the PBS series Making Black America Through the Grapevine; Dr. Ashley Farmer, renowned historian and professor at the University of Texas at Austin; and Pastor Dr. D.Z. Cofield, senior pastor of the historic Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. The panel, along with our digital audience members, previewed a 30-minute screener of Making Black America just before our discussion.
When we think about integration, we think about the gains that were made, but at what cost? At what cost to Black life? At what cost to Black institutions? At what cost to Black neighborhoods?
Dr. Farmer, do you think there was a loss of community that came with integration in our country? I mean, what made integration more beneficial to middle-class Blacks?
So integration certainly opened doors for a segment of the Black population. I think there's no denying that. And it helped us create what would now maybe be considered a Black middle class, or what somebody might call the Black elite, right? And there is something to be said for Black faces and places where they couldn't be before. And that argument is, I'm not saying that's my argument, but that argument is that there should be no place where a Black person is not allowed to go. There should be no place where a Black person should not be welcome. There should be no place where a Black person cannot be treated with respect, right? And if we don't push those boundaries or enter in one by one or in a trickle, how will we ever sustain and understand that, right? But the converse of that is that when you allow everybody to go into these spaces, some people choose to do it, some people not, but there's certainly a diffusion of Black people. And with that diffusion of Black people, we have to start asking questions about whether there's a diffusion of resources. And by resources, I don't necessarily mean money, but by resources, I mean community togetherness, right? Moving as a collective together towards the same goal. I mean, working together to solve problems and share resources in terms of love, housing, right? Respect, all of those things. And so to take that to a kind of more concrete example about why some people are questioning the value of integration, let's talk about Brown v. Board, right? So certainly allow people to go where they wanted to go in theory, right? We know that it did not happen with all deliberate speed, as was the Supreme Court asked, but that also meant that it diluted the number of Black teachers, right? Because some Black teachers went some places, some Black the other. It diluted the number of Black students. It diluted and changed the funding of how schools are related. So there's a real question there about whether we want to continue to do that or the value of doing that in order to prove that Black people can be everywhere and what is lost by that. The people that I study in the Black Power movement would argue that there's more lost by trying to be the 1, 2, or 3 that go into the white community versus building political, economic, cultural capital and power within our communities. And that's the best way to solve issues that are happening within our communities, because just because we're together doesn't mean that we don't have issues that affect and put us at odds with each other, but also the way to move with purpose together towards oppressive forces, right?
This question from the audience is something that I was thinking about as I was watching the snippet as well, but she just articulated so wonderful. The question is, I'm from that post-World War II generation that really feels conflicted about the value of integration and its impact upon our communities. How do we safeguard and enhance our rich cultural legacies in an open society? By the way, this middle-aged 6th-generation Texan sister was born Black, embraces and capitalizes Black, and will always be Black in honor of all the ancestors. She's Black and proud. I love that. But yeah, how do we safeguard and enhance our rich cultural legacies in an open society?
Well, I'll start by saying I think events like this, and I think works like this, help us so much because we get to tell our own story. We get to create our own images. And I think that's so valuable because, you know, one of the things that I've learned is when you don't teach your own history, it's hard to get mad at somebody else who doesn't teach it. Because one, many of them are ignorant of it. And then secondly, they don't appreciate it because they haven't lived it. And so, you know, for me, the challenge is always, how do we help our students, our young people in particular, and some of our older people understand the history? I was reading a history book of the Black community in one city, and in many instances, all they could show were empty lots of where historic events took place or where historic buildings were, that this was the location where, you know, this took place and this person ate and dined, or this is where this motel was where this person stayed. But those buildings are gone, right? And so how do we tell our story? And so I'm so appreciative of these two ladies that I share this panel with, and want to encourage people to record those stories, to tell those stories. That's why I think Black media is so important, that we are telling stories that are relevant to us. And we're taking almost a FUBU approach, right? As for us, by us. And it doesn't matter whether you approve of it or not. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter whether you understand it if you're not part of this culture, because we're telling our own story.
I'll just kind of piggyback on what you said, Reverend Cofield, because I totally agree. I think it's also, like you said, telling our story. I think it's also generations reminding the next generation of, you know, what they've been through, what they're doing. You think of organizations that still exist today. You think about the organizations that don't exist today. You know, is it a time to reflect and see if we need to revisit some of those? You know, and also as a storyteller, I mean, documentary film is a way to tell our story for us, by us. And I think it's important, like you said, to also do the oral and also to preserve that story as well. That I feel like, you know, from doing these films for so long, we didn't have a lot of agency when it came to our visuals. So I always encourage people, if you have images of your family, you know, save those, scan those, because that, again, is safeguarding how we view ourselves, how we've seen ourselves, how we've documented ourselves. And I think that is an individual way of doing it. And then collectively, again, just, you know, telling those stories in the groups and organizations and revisiting some of the ones which you'll see in the series, possibly.
I love that. Dr. Farmer, did you want to say something else? I noticed you unclicked your mute.
I just wanted to add, I love this conversation because the number one thing when people ask me is I say, don't wait for somebody else to collect anything. Start becoming your own archivist, start becoming your own collector. Get a box out, throw everything in there. If you're sitting around the dinner table or it's Thanksgiving, I started bringing a recorder. Right? A tape recorder to Thanksgiving dinners when I knew some of my elders were getting older and just recording the conversation that was going on. Don't always think that you need some sort of formal training. Don't always think that, you got to set up something with the right sound and everything. Just document as much as you can and save as much as you can. And don't wait on other institutions or groups to do it for us. But I also, really like this comment about where we're talking about historical preservation on a different level. There are wonderful classes that people can take. Some of them are at universities like UT Austin and other places that are summer classes on historical preservation to help get certain places as historical markers. So as much as we can do that kind of work of making sure that things aren't torn down, so there's a story to tell, the better we are. So I just want to add that in, that anybody can do this work, and I encourage you to just do it and collect it.
Great point. Great point.
At the heart of our story are the networks Black Americans built for survival and for sheer pleasure and joy.
As Black people, we've always had networks, always. From the moment we were thrown on slave ships to the moment we were placed on plantations, and those networks, in some ways, extend all the way to the present.
Booker T. Washington nicknamed this the Grapevine Telegraph. And the grapevine is as old as the American Revolution.
What is it that makes Black Americans so resilient in a country that still, to this very day, doesn't fully embrace them, doesn't fully accept them?
It's a really good question, and a very deep question, which I don't know if we can fully answer.
I know, right?
But I'm still meditating on that question. I will say one thing is the Black church. I think that, and I think Reverend Colford, you could definitely probably speak to that, that is very instrumental in just our foundation and our resilience. Tried to separate us, but we still found ways to come together. So I think just our faith, our belief has informed us, encouraged us, and made us extremely resilient.
Yeah, I love the phrase at the very beginning, the sanctity of Blackness. I wanted to stand up and just cheer that, because despite how we have been portrayed in mass media and are still being portrayed, we know as part of the community that what's highlighted many times is not the norm, but it's the outlier, it's the exception. And when people say to me, for example, in some of my Christian settings, and these are non-African Americans, they would say, DZ, I don't see you as a Black man, I just see you as a brother in Christ. And I know what they're trying to say, but Eddie, I'm 6'5", 350 pounds. Like, how can you not see me as a Black man, right?
Interesting.
But I understand what they're saying. They're trying to say they don't see me as the images that have been portrayed. And what they fail to understand is that, seeing me for who I have been created to be is part of the beauty of God, right? Celebrating that diversity. And I think in the Black church, we have celebrated that. We have given people a sense of value, a sense of worth, and also have been autonomous. I've been able to say things in media. I've been able to speak truth to power, in part because I do have a congregation and they have my back. And so I'm not beholden. Out of our church, there was a lawsuit in 1944, Smith versus Allwright. And the plaintiff in that lawsuit was Dr. Lonnie Smith. And Dr. Lonnie Smith was a dentist in Houston's Fourth Ward community. Lonnie Smith, 95% of his practice was African-American. And the reason he was chosen to file this lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, was argued by Thurgood Marshall, and opened up primary elections to everyone, because whites in Harris County were declaring that the Democratic Party, and this is back when we had Dixie Democrats, was a private club, and African Americans could not vote in the Democratic primary. And, but Lonnie Smith was chosen because he wasn't beholden, and they knew that white people couldn't hurt him economically. And so he was able to stand and be part of that historic lawsuit 10 years before Brown versus the Board of Education. And so, for me, that sanctity, that place where we can affirm one another and celebrate one another and can find respite and find shelter there, I think is so important to who we are as a people.
How can we tell the story of Black Americans and not speak about reconciliation among ourselves? We are participating in a rally cry of equity from others, yet we are still fighting. What are your thoughts on how to move into resolution toward Black joy?
Well, I'll just say this very quickly. I'll just say this. I think in our community, we have to deal with the issue of self-hatred and self-loathing. I think we have to be honest with that. And I think we have to also recognize how classism has moved into our community. And so many times, even in fighting in communities, I'll hear other Black people of means say, those people. And I'm like, who are those people? Like, you think they're different than you are? Like, that's where you grew up, but for the grace of God, there go you. And I think that's part of what we lost, to be honest with you, in integration. We lost that sense of community where we're going to help one another and encourage one another and mentor and, do those kinds of things. And so I think that is a challenge. My late pastor, Dr. A. Lewis Patterson, would say those of us who have the light have a moral obligation to go where there's darkness. And so do we see our communities as places where we need to go back? If we think we've been delivered, if we think we're better, then that just gives us more of a responsibility to go back and help somebody else.
Dr. Farmer?
Yeah, well, I think this is where history and being students of history in all these different ways, from watching documentaries to reading books, right, to self-educating online, however you can do that, is really important. And it's twofold, right? One is to understand who to be mad at, right? I think there's a lot of times, I say this a lot to my students as well. The problem is that you're mad at the wrong person, or the mad group of people, or the people that you think have power, which are actually the stand-in for the real power, or a representative for the real kind of larger system of oppression. And when we start to look at kind of the history in the longer term, like this film does, it shows us that who we should be mad at is not typically those inside our community. They're proxies for larger processes of power. And then when you start to think about it like that, you're less fractious kind of internally, and you can start to come together and think about this in terms of external solutions. Also, and this goes back to our kind of earlier questions, one of the things that I think makes Black people so resilient are our freedom dreams, or our political imagination. And by that, I mean that if you've never been incorporated or treated as a citizen in a nation state, then your vision of what freedom, a vision of what your life could be, is much bigger than what the United States is trying to offer you, or what the American government is trying to offer you, right? And Black people, one of the things I love about studying history, particularly the Black Power movement, is how expansive our dreams of how the world could be instead were. And so the more that we get together and start thinking about what kind of world do we actually want to live in? What kind of things do we want to have the government or the nation state do for us? What kinds of things do we want to do for ourselves? We can start working together in that way, which is joyous to think about, but also is a resolution internally.
Coming up, we continue our panel discussion on the PBS series entitled Making Black America Through the Grapevine. With all of this conversation about the Black experience, how much is too much? Is Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., host of this PBS series, giving out too much information in these documentaries? And what about those Black Greek-lettered fraternities and sororities? How do they still honor and preserve their mission now that non-Blacks have been allowed to join these organizations? I'm Eddie Robinson, a final segment of I See You that you do not want to miss. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to I See You. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're sharing with you portions of a taped panel discussion that was recently recorded live during a Zoom webinar hosted by Texas PBS and Houston Public Media. We're talking about the latest PBS docuseries entitled Making Black America Through the Grapevine. The project features famed Finding Your Roots host Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., and he takes us on a journey of the moments that transformed the Black community. During the webinar, panelists, along with our virtual audience, watched a 30-minute snippet of the film, and then we chatted about it afterwards, even conducting a Q&A with the audience. The panelists included the director of the film, Stacy Holman, a featured historian from the film and University of Texas professor, Dr. Ashley Farmer, and senior pastor of the historic Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston, Texas, Dr. D.Z. Cofield. Our virtual audience inundated us with some great questions, so many questions we literally ran out of time. But we'd love to hear your questions and feedback now as you're listening to our dialogue. Visit iseeushow.org to voice your opinion. Or send us a tweet, respond on Instagram. You can even send us an email. Our address, talk@iseeushow.org. We continue our panel discussion. I do want to step back a bit and just talk about the Greek-lettered organizations where, at the start of the 20th century, a small number of Black students came together, mainly from HBCUs, to uplift and educate the Black community from these racial inequities, these social dilemmas, by forming these sororities and fraternities, these Black Greek-lettered organizations collectively known as the Divine Nine.
The HBCU commitment to lifting the race by building a collective sense of mission and pride wasn't limited to the classroom. In fact, two of these institutions, Morgan and Howard, served as the birthplace for one of the most powerful and enduring social networks in the history of Black America, Black Greek letter organizations.
The first of these organizations, Alpha Phi Alpha, which I'm a member of, founded in Cornell in 1906, but most of the organizations were founded at Howard. I do want to get some insight, especially those, if you are part of the Greek and sorority fraternity. I'm Stacy Holman, shout out to you, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. But here's an interesting question as it relates to Black fraternities and sororities. How do they still serve their initial purposes now that non-Blacks have been allowed to join these organizations? Stacy, what do you think?
Well, they are majority Black, so I think that's why they're able to continue to do the work that they're able to do and to hone in the community. They have stayed true to their morals, true to their mission, I should say. And that mission has grown because a lot of our organizations now are international, but the true ethos of it and where it began, I think will forever just cement it and still make it a predominant Black organizations.
Right. Dr. Cofield?
Well, I think, for me, I'm part of Me Phi Me.
Nice.
As I said, I went to a PWI, so we didn't have
PWI. There you go.
Fraternities on our campus.
Okay.
But for me, I think the issue is more cultural than racial.
Okay.
And, to be perfectly honest with you, some of the work that we have to do, being Black is not enough. Being African-American is not enough. There's a cultural connectivity that you have. And I'm not saying people who are not African-American can't have that cultural connectivity, but I do know some people who are African-American who don't always display that cultural connectivity. And so I think, the beauty of those organizations, fraternities and sororities, we work with them in our community. all the time, partner with them through our church, is there is a cultural connectivity and a commitment that they have, to echo what Dr. Holman says, that goes back to its roots, regardless of how long or how old the organization is. And I think as long as that commitment is there, then that organization continues to have viability as it was intended when it was founded.
I'll also just add that from another standpoint, they are those institutions, right? They are historical institutions. They are, in the absence of being able to have a building, right? In the absence of being able to have a school, in the absence of being able to have a monument or something that is an ode to both what Black people stand for and what we want to do collectively, the sororities and fraternities serve as that, both through their history and their record keeping and their lineage, but also the way that they continue to function in service of those ideals today.
You know, the concept of the white gaze, the concept of the veil, you know, that was also made reference to in the screener, and especially the veil, right? You know, with the author of Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, uses this concept of the veil and the double consciousness to explain these peculiar conditions within which Blacks found themselves grappling with.
But sometimes, if you read a novel about Black people, if you see a film about Black people, you think all we do in private is talk about white people, white racism, and woe is me.
No.
And that's just not the truth.
Well, this is what's great about August Wilson. He creates an entire world that's just Black folks.
And Toni Morrison said, invisible to whom?
Yeah.
And she said, I'm turning the gaze inward.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about the Black gaze, not the white gaze.
And what whole novel, you know, just with what we have amongst ourselves.
Yeah, a self-contained all Black universe.
I know when I was growing up, you know, I would see my parents and how they would, even my grandparents too, how they would choreograph their behaviors, their language, their mannerisms differently, depending upon who they'd be talking to or speaking with. Stacey, as a filmmaker, director, producer of this project, I really want to get your thoughts on this question, and perhaps you and your team asked this question over the course of perhaps even post-production or even during the shoots. How much is too much when it comes to sharing the Black experience, or better yet, the experiences of communities of color in these documentaries? You know, did you ever ask yourself that question? You know, sometimes in essence, on some aspects of the Black experience, you know, sometimes silence is golden. But was there ever a question of giving out too much of the reveal?
That's a great question, Eddie. Yeah, there was, short answer, you know. It's kind of like, well, do you want to tell them how, you know, how we did this? Do you want to tell them about just, you know, how we, you know, our resilience, you know, how we're able to, you know, make it through? And it is a balance. And it was kind of a hard pull. Like, do I want to tell the story? You know, because we're serving, you know, we're showing it to two different audiences. I mean, they're, you know, this is celebrating us, but also it's kind of sharing a little bit of us as well. But in sharing, though, I think it's also, there's no way that I think once we've shared it can be broken, if that makes sense, you know? But it is that fine line of really kind of figuring out, you know, how much of the story is important to tell. You know, is it serving the story? You know, we're not going to tell all our secrets, but we're going to tell, you know, we did kind of share a little bit. Yeah. You know, there was a couple nods and winks. I don't know if you noticed those in the barbershop. No, just kidding.
I saw.
No, but let me say this, Stacey, I really appreciated the work that you all did.
Yes.
Because for those of us who are in the community, you gave us a sense of sanity, you know, by saying, hey, this is going, it's like, man, you know what? I'm not the only one. Yes. I can say some stuff to my friends too that I can't say to some other people. You know, Robin Roberts calls it the nod, right? When you see us like and give them the nod, it was like, I just felt like I was getting nods all the way through.
Great.
You know, with my and thinking about my grandparents and my parents, you know, and it was just all throughout the program. I was like, I got it. I'm with you. Nice. Yeah. So I appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
Well, you know, Dr. Farmer, I mean, of all that you've accomplished You're a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. As a result of your successes in the professional world, as well as an amazing person that you are, can you share with us what life lessons have you learned about yourself moving forward thus far?
Oh man, I had to go first. Let's see. I think that I learned a resilience in my own self that I did not necessarily know I had before. I went from being cocooned in an HBCU to then going to getting a graduate degree and living and working in largely predominantly white environments, and often being one of the only Black professors and certainly an only Black woman professor.
Interesting.
And it's been incredibly rewarding, but also a minefield that I've had to navigate that I did not know I would have to navigate in the same way. I would say the second thing is that, like, and this is going to sound a little trite, but like, the kids are all right. Like, I work on a college campus, and I think young people get a really, really bad rap. But having been of one and then worked and being with them every day, they really have a wonderful perspective on the world that reminds me not to be so pessimistic and to have hope. And that practice of hope is not something that ebbs and flows, but something that you've got to do every day. And I think working with college-age children who are very hopeful about the world that's coming in front of them, it's taught me very much to have that same outlook.
Love that. Stacey, we'll get your insight. After working on this incredible series, Making Black America, the work that you've done on the Black church, that series was phenomenal. All that you've accomplished as an acclaimed producer, as a wonderful filmmaker, what life lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
You used my word, Ashley, resilience, so I got to think of another one.
It's a powerful word.
Yeah, I think what I've learned is that it's all good, that it's all going to be okay. I've learned that no matter what I've gone through, no matter what I'm going to face, that I can persevere, that I can go through, from working on all of these incredible projects about our story, about our narrative, has just informed who I am, has encouraged who I am, has reminded me of who I am, and made me feel more responsible of telling others who we are and really sharing that. So that story in story form and documentary form. So it's really just, I've learned that, I'm an amazing person. We are an amazing people. And I have history to prove how amazing and resilient and incredible and powerful that I am.
Yeah. And we needed this series, right? We needed that reminder.
Yes.
Again, to just we understand the struggle, but we needed to hear the joy in our lives.
Yeah. The struggle is so easy to talk about. The struggle is but it's like we got to take those pockets of, there's joy in struggle. There's joy in struggle.
There is. Dr. Cofield, as a radio host at KTSU and working as senior pastor of the historic Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Greater Houston, what life lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Yeah, so I'm at an interesting age, Eddie. I'm 60, and I've gotten to a place now where I tell people, if you really wanted me to care about your opinion of me, you should have caught me in my 40s. I'm at a really, really unique place, not cocky, but very comfortable in who I am in my skin. And for me, coming to that place where I'm not looking for the affirmation of other people to validate me, especially the affirmation of people who were part of a group that oppressed me. I think so many times we look for validation from the outside in instead of learning how to live from the value that we have from the inside out. And that value comes from me understanding whose image I was created in and whose child I am. Not just a child of God, but Barbara and Zanis Cofield, right? And my grandparents and the tremendous people that they were. And man, I take joy in that. I celebrate that, to think about the us's in my life. You know, in Genesis 1:27, the text says, let us make man in our own image. And I always like to say there's never the making of any man or woman without an us behind them. And when I think about the us's in my life that have poured into my life to help me become who I am and who I will become, I just rejoice in that. And I was just reminded of that as I looked at this and have looked at the documentaries, you know, that I'm good because I come from a great people and I stand on great shoulders. And now it's my responsibility to allow this next generation to stand on my shoulders so we can continue to become the best that we can possibly be.
A remarkable conversation about the PBS series Making Black America Through the Grapevine, a 4-part series that's hosted by Harvard scholar and documentarian Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Thanks to our panel of guests, film director and producer with McGee Media, Stacey Holman, University of Texas at Austin professor Dr. Ashley Farmer, and senior pastor of Good Hope Missionary Baptist in Houston, Pastor Dr. D.Z. Cofield. Our virtual webinar partners include KERA, KTSU, Houston Public Media, and Texas PBS. Presenting partners for the event, WETA, WEDA, and ViewHouse. ICU Technical Director Todd Holzlander, producer Laura Walker, editors Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Visit our show page, iseeushow.org. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening.